On March 1st, 1954, a Japanese fishing boat called Lucky Dragon 5 became contaminated by nuclear fallout from the United States testing thermonuclear weapons in the ocean nearby. The crew suffered acute radiation syndrome, and one member of the crew eventually died of radiation sickness. This came less than a decade after the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, so Japan's nuclear fears and anxieties were at an all-time high. Meanwhile, at this time, Japanese film studio Toho were developing their own monster movie, inspired by the success of films like King Kong and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Toho producer Tomoyuki Tanaka conceived an idea based on the Lucky Dragon 5 incident about a giant, ancient creature under the sea, which is awoken by nuclear testing. That movie, of course, became Godzilla. Released later that year, it did indeed become as successful a monster movie as King Kong, but with its own very unique tone, tapping into those feelings of fear, anxiety, guilt, and sadness of post-war Japan. And while Godzilla went on to become one of the biggest cultural icons of all time, spawning countless sequels, remakes, and spin-offs, and its own genre, kaiju, the original movie still remains unique and one of the most effective and devastating monster movies ever made. Join me as we continue our series on nature in horror movies, and we discuss Ashiro Honda's monumental monster movie, Godzilla. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike Muncer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 10th season called Nature Bites Back, and this is part 3. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be discussing one movie, and that is the classic Godzilla from 1954. This will be a spoilerific discussion. Please check out the movie if you haven't done so. It's a brilliant film. I know it's actually kind of hard to come by in the UK. I was able to order a Criterion Blu-ray. I do believe you can pick it up on physical media, but it's quite hard to stream, sadly. But if you can, seek out the movie and give it a watch before you listen to our discussion. So joining me to discuss all things Godzilla, a very exciting brand new guest. If you're in the horror community, I'm sure you will know of this man. You will have probably seen him in one of the countless horror movies that he's appeared in over the last few years, whether it's The Leech or Beyond the Gates or Bliss or Suitable Flesh alongside Barbara Crampton and Heather Graham. He's also a filmmaker. He's just completed his latest feature film called The Lonely Man with the Ghost Machine. But most importantly for this week's episode, he is also the author of one of the most beautiful books in my collection, a book called Godzilla, the Official Guide to the King of the Monsters. He is one of the biggest voices of authority on Godzilla and Godzilla movies, and I'm very lucky to have him here. A big welcome to Graeme Skipper. Hello, Graeme.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. How are things? You seem to be one of the busiest men in horror. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, things have been busy. I directed a film last year called The Lonely Man with the Ghost Machine, which just had its premiere at Seattle Make Believe Festival. We're going to be playing Chattanooga coming up soon. And a few other fests later on down the year. So excited to be getting that out there and letting people have a look at it. I'm acting in a couple of films right now and working on writing some new stuff. And I don't know. I'm just trying to stay busy and always keep things moving, always keep something in the fire.
I love it. How do you kind of describe yourself to people? Would you say, are you an actor first and foremost, writer, author, director, producer? Because you seem to do everything.
I don't even know anymore. I guess I'll always be an actor first. I mean, that's how I got my start. And that's always, sort of my great love is getting to go on set and get to inhabit a role and play in someone's world. But I love writing. I love directing and producing and just creating stuff, and I realized a while ago that in this business, especially in the indie business, you really have to create your own work.
Sure.
You can't just wait around for somebody to give you something. You have to make it yourself. And so that's what I'm always trying to do is, I'm always happier when I'm working on something anyway. And so it's always nice to have something churning. My goal is always to have at least one thing by the end of the year that I've accomplished in the entertainment world. So
tell us a little bit about kind of your relationship and history with the horror genre generally. Do you remember when you first kind of fell in love with the genre?
Sure. I've always been a horror kid. I was that annoying guy in my friend group that would make all of my friends skip the Halloween parties and act in my haunted house that I'd built.
Amazing. Love that.
Yeah, I first fell in love with horror. I had always been really interested in like the iconography of it. I had a book that my dad had gotten me that was a big picture book that had all of the movie monsters in it. So it had all the Universal monsters, but it also had like Jason and Freddy and Leatherface and Pinhead and all that. Mm-hmm. And I was way too scared to watch those movies, but I was fascinated by them, and I would read about the movies and about the characters, and I would look at the scary pictures, and that was enough. But I was always really like into it. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, I think I was 11 years old, and I had the thought, I went, I think I'm going to like these movies. I'm really scared to watch them, but maybe if I watch the scariest one first, that means I'll get it out of the way. It'll be like ripping off a Band-Aid, and I'll be able to watch all the other ones, and it'll be great. Uh-huh. So I asked my dad, I said, what's the scariest movie ever made? And he said, well, I think it's The Exorcist. And I said, well, can we watch The Exorcist?
Wow.
And he said, okay. So I sat between my parents on the couch, 11 years old. We watched The Exorcist. It scared the shit out of me. Absolutely wrecked me. I slept in my parents' bedroom that night. I was up all night convinced I was going to get possessed. But the thing about it was I woke up the next morning. Well, I hadn't slept, but the sun came up, and it was a Saturday or a Sunday, so I didn't have school. And the very first thing that I wanted to do was watch it again during the daytime. Mm-hmm. And that, I must have watched it 2 or 3 times that day because I found it so interesting. It still scared me and was still shocking. But 1, with it being daylight, and 2, with me now having seen these things over and over, I was able to start to anticipate jump scares. I was able to see, okay, well, I see here where this is a fake head. I see what they're doing. And I started in a very rudimentary way to understand a little bit more about movie making and about that there's like a craft behind this. Mm-hmm. And it set me off. I started watching everything that I could. I would have my friends over for slumber parties, and I would go to the Blockbuster, and I would ask the clerk, I'd say like, all right, I want all the basics. I want Jason, I want Freddy, I want Leatherface, I want Pinhead. What do I rent? What do I watch? Mm-hmm. And that started me off. And I've been a fan ever since. I was very, very lucky through just the bizarre world of the entertainment industry and of people that I'd worked with to get connected with Stuart Gordon, to audition for Reanimator the musical, mm-hmm. and then being in that introduced me to the whole LA horror community, and that is how then I was able to move my career into being a horror actor, which is really what I've always wanted. I mean, I've always told people, if ever I were to become like any kind of an actor with any kind of a name, that like when I'm walking down the street, if I were to see like Tom Cruise, right? I don't know that I wouldn't, I mean, I'd be amazed because it's Tom Cruise, but I wouldn't be like clamoring to shake his hand. I wouldn't be freaking out. I wouldn't be begging for his autograph. But if I saw Bruce Campbell,
yeah.
If I saw Robert Englund,
yeah.
If I saw Tony Todd, like those are the people that I would freak out over. And so I want to be that for someone someday, mm-hmm. Because that's what always inspired me. And those are the, like if I'm ever having a really shitty day, I pop on Evil Dead 2. And that's my comfort blanket. And a lot of people think that's weird or whatever, but I don't care about that. I love horror, and I know that's something that folks like you and I, like we bond over, and I think that's why the horror community is so tight knit.
Totally.
Because to some degree, we're all those weirdos that nobody else ever understood.
Absolutely.
And now we found each other.
You find your people, don't you? And that must have been such an amazing thing as well. You know, you talked about your heroes. You know, for so many of us, people like Barbara Crampton are in that kind of category, right? Who you now have worked with multiple times. Like, things like that must be quite a dream come true, I imagine.
It's amazing. I mean, I pinch myself. I mean, Barbara's a friend now, which is just like wild. And same with, like opening night of Reanimator, Barbara was there, Bruce Abbott, Jeffrey Combs, Brian Usna was there, and I'm just standing there and I'm meeting these people that I've, idolized for my whole life. And they're just people, but they share with us clearly a love for what they do and for this strange material that a lot of people, I think a lot of actors would balk at, and I just really admire that about folks like that unabashedly love the material, that are clearly dedicated to treating it with respect. Barbara's certainly one of those. And I've been so fortunate to through my experience over the past 10 or 12 years to get to work with some of them and meet some of them and just see that they all are indeed fans just as much as we are.
I love this. Amazing. Well, Graeme, let's talk about Godzilla, shall we? Because this is what we're here to talk about this week. We are going to talk about the original 1954 movie in depth, but I'd love to ask you first of all about your book, Godzilla, the official guide to the King of the Monsters, right? This beautiful hardback book. I'm holding it in my hand right now.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
I love it so much. It's so tactile as well, isn't it?
It's cool, right? Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the book and how you came to this project and how you came to write this book.
Yeah. So I've been a lifelong Godzilla fan, and we could talk about that, in a minute. But so how did it start? So in December of 2019, I get a call from a friend of mine who was working at Toho North America, and he called me, and they were looking for someone to help them write and produce a number of comedic shorts that were basically going to be these sort of like re-edits of scenes from old Japanese Godzilla films that were then going to be worked into like little comedic bits, something about like Godzilla and his son, or like instead of Ghidorah, instead of like my three sons, Ghidorah is my three heads, and like little silly things. And the idea, I think, was just to try to make Godzilla kind of accessible again for mainstream, or at least the Japanese Godzilla, to make it, to bring it back to being a little bit more just kind of in the mainstream consciousness and a little bit more accessible, especially to kids. And so I went in and I sort of pitched them my general ideas. They wanted something like 10 shorts done. And part of that process was I digitized all the films and I time-coded every second of every single film. Every time something interesting happened, every time a character was introduced, every time a cool moment occurred, I wrote all those down because we had to know when we were going to be editing these, like what to pull from. And basically I did that. I did that project with them. Probably a year and a half later, he called me back and he said, hey, we just signed this deal with this publisher and we want to write this book that is the like definitive official guide to the franchise. And he said, I can't think of anybody that is more prepared for knowing every single thing about every one of these movies than you. And so, he asked if I wanted to do it. Of course, I jumped at the chance. And I talked about that horror book that I had earlier when I was a kid, that so inspired me. And that was really what drove me with this, was I wanted to create a book like that for the Godzilla franchise. It's a very intimidating franchise. There's 36 films. It's a massive thing. There's comic books, there's video games, there's TV shows, there's all sorts of stuff. And now, more on the way. And it's something that a lot of people are like, I don't really know where to start. What do I show my kids? Some people just don't like old black and white movies, or they're turned away by them. Some people, and they're like, well, then if I watch all these, I got to watch the first one. Well, you really don't. This is a franchise where you can jump into it kind of anywhere. There's different, and we talk about that in the book. so that was really how it came about. And I mean, it was one of the best jobs I've ever had. I mean, it was great. I would wake up, have my coffee, I would watch a Godzilla film, and then I would do a ton of research about it, and then write a draft of a chapter about that film.
Love that.
And then I would move on. And I did that, and then went back through. They gave me access to the whole official Toho, the photo archive, for all their promotional imagery, everything. And I was able to go in there. I was able to choose what I wanted, and choose where they went, and all that stuff. And Welbeck Publishing, who put that book together. I mean, like you mentioned, the beautiful tactile cover, and it's really a show-stopping book when you see it on a shelf.
It is.
So I'm just so proud of it, and I am especially proud when I have friends, that send me a picture of like their 8-year-old son, like sitting on his bunk bed, like reading the book. That's who I wrote this for.
And that's really fascinating too, isn't it? And we'll talk about this as we go. The way in which this character, this series, this genre, whatever you want to call it, kind of kaiju, blurs the line between horror, like proper horror for grown-ups, and then stuff for kids, right, as well, and the way in which that has kind of changed and evolved over the years.
It's amazing. It's one of the things that I find most fascinating about this franchise, and why I love the franchise so much, because it has everything, right? Like you just said, it has actual true, like, Criterion level horror. But then if you want something on a Saturday morning to watch with your 6-year-old, it's got that too. It's really a cool franchise, and something that I think is worth diving into. And I've been very happy to see, due to the resurgence of Godzilla excitement around the world, people wanting to talk about it more, especially this first film.
Well, totally. I think it feels like Godzilla right now is more popular than ever before, right? With all of the reboots and big blockbuster movies. So let's do it. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. We are going to discuss Godzilla, the original movie from 1954. Graeme, just set us up. Give us a little brief plot synopsis of Godzilla.
So the original, it begins with the destruction of a Japanese boat called the Eikomaru, and it's out near this place called Odo Island, which is out, it's out in the Sea of Japan. And there's only a few survivors, and they find that all the fish are dead, and that eventually this monster, whatever monster it was that destroyed the boat, comes to land and then destroys a village on Odo Island, and they say it is Gojira. It is a monster from the bottom of the sea. Eventually, of course, there's an investigation into what this is. We've got, of course, a whole political panel trying to figure out how to deal with the problem. We've got a scientist, Dr. Yamane, who is not a zoologist, but he's clearly like a lover of biology and a lover of life and of nature. And he's trying to sort of find a peaceful way to interact with this new discovery. And you've got a love story that's going on between Hideto Ogata and Emiko Yamane. Emiko is Dr. Yamane's daughter, so there's a little bit of tension there because Ogata, he's all in the gung-ho military, let's go kill the thing camp. And then you've got probably my favorite character of this whole thing, Dr. Serizawa, who is a bit of a mad scientist. He used to date Emiko, and he is developing a mystery weapon that nobody really knows about, and even he's really afraid of. Basically, Godzilla comes to land, military attacks it, military stands no chance against Godzilla. Godzilla ends up coming through and completely destroying Tokyo in the most incredible sequence in the movie. And they end up enlisting Dr. Serizawa to use his weapon, which is called the Oxygen Destroyer, to ultimately defeat Godzilla. And they say that it removes all the oxygen from the water, is how the Oxygen Destroyer works, and it'll basically destroy all life in Tokyo Bay. The way it's represented is that it like sort of strips the flesh from everything in the water, and it's pretty gruesome. And Dr. Serizawa clearly sees this as like a doomsday weapon, and so his final sort of act of heroism is that he takes it down in the water, he sets it off, but he also stays down there with it so that nobody else can create it again. That is of course, Godzilla is destroyed. That is the basic overall plot, which sounds pretty thin, but this movie to me is more about mood and about themes than it is about plot. And so it's a really and later on, we'll talk about the American version of it, which I think tries to steer more towards plot. We'll talk about that, but the Japanese version is this very moody, atmospheric, almost elegiac film that is about the themes and the sensation and the feelings that happened in Japan, not just during Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the firebombing of Tokyo, and the people's reactions to that and what they were feeling at the time when this movie came out.
Yeah, it's such a mood, this film, isn't it? And you're absolutely right. And I think that about some of the best Japanese horror anyway, that so often they are more concerned with mood rather than that sort of conventional Western plot mechanic, I suppose, And of course, I think that is one of the things that surprised me when I first came to this film. It surprises everyone, I think, when they first watch this film, that it does take itself seriously. There is a real feeling of dread, but also melancholy. There's a kind of sadness, right? A mournfulness that kind of hangs over this movie. It's really powerful. And I guess that's because of where Japan as a country were at this point in time, right? The kind of the general mood of the nation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in 1954, you have to remember this is less than 10 years after the bombs dropped.
Yes.
Right. So we are still very much in the wake of World War II. And so a lot of stuff was going on in Japan at the time. I mean, you have a Japan that is still actively rebuilding from not only both of the atomic bombs, but also the firebombing of Tokyo, which is so the aftermath of that is so beautifully rendered in Godzilla -1.
Yes.
You also have the fact that there's an American occupation. All of a sudden, Japan is without a military. And even though everybody's saying, oh, now we're all peaceful, then all of a sudden, I think it was March of 1954, is when the Lucky Dragon 5, which is a Japanese fishing vessel, was showered with radiation when the U.S. tested a hydrogen bomb. And that immediately fired up the fears in Japan of, oh my God, it's happening again.
Yeah.
Can we eat the fish? Can we? Because when we dropped the bombs, nobody really knew the extent of what the radiation was going to do.
Yeah.
And that was maybe the most horrific part of what everybody discovered, but especially the Japanese who were there and who experienced it, of the destructive nature and the terror of that radiation. Yeah. And so then to have this happen again to a Japanese fishing vessel, where it's yet again, the Japanese are the ones that are suffering because the Americans are dropping all of these super dangerous weapons, it brought all those fears back right away. And that was what inspired Tomoyuki Tanaka, the producer, to come up with this idea. It was like a trifecta of ideas. It was, he had wanted to make a monster movie because he'd just seen The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which is a Ray Harryhausen movie about a giant octopus kraken thing. And Godzilla, or King Kong, the original King Kong,
of course,
had just been re-released as part of its 10th anniversary the year before, or 20th anniversary the year before. And then the Lucky Dragon 5 incident happens. And he was on a plane and he thought, oh, this is our movie. It's a movie about an atomic monster. And that was how the process started for creating this film that ultimately was going to be essentially an anti-war film about the dangers of the atomic age.
It's fascinating, and we'll come back to a lot of these points as we go. But let me ask you, that's the kind of really interesting context of where Japan was at the time. Tell me a little bit about the context of where monster movies were at the time, I suppose. I mean, you talked about King Kong there, which kind of still felt like, 20 years later was still looming large, right? As this massive, really popular movie kind of all across the world.
Yeah. King Kong was still reigning supreme. Like I said, you had these Ray Harryhausen films, like Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. We hadn't quite gotten into the alien scares of the 1950s. Godzilla was really the movie that kicked off the atomic age scare movie in Hollywood. Prior to this, of course, you had the Universal monster movies, but there weren't as many movies being made, leading up before World War II.
Yeah.
So you had these movies, like a movie like King Kong came out in 1933. Well, of course, that's going to be, they're going to keep re-releasing it because it's a super popular movie and it's going to continue to be a big deal. But they weren't churning them out like they were. I mean, they were churning out, you had like a ton of Frankenstein movies, a ton of Wolfman movies and stuff like that. But of course, in Japan, the minute that World War II starts, then they stop getting anything from Hollywood.
Yeah.
And they also stop getting permission. I mean, there are stories about like Akira Kurosawa trying to get films made like at the beginning and during World War II that the censor boards would say was too Western. It's too American. You can't do that. And so a lot of the movies that were his influences, like old Westerns and stuff like that, he had a harder time tapping into because the censor boards wouldn't allow it.
Yeah.
So, so really, I mean, and I'm not a expert on all monster movies by any means, but, to my knowledge, like the state of the monster movie was, you had some of these, Ray Harryhausen was huge. You had, these stop motion movies, which is originally what Tanaka wanted for Godzilla, is he wanted him to be a stop motion monster. You had stuff like that. And then you had older films, like King Kong, that were just getting constantly re-released and were still super popular. Yeah. But nothing like Godzilla had come out, especially not, we'll get into why this happened, but especially not the idea of a giant monster that was a man in a suit. That was totally new.
Yeah, I love that. Well, tell me then a little bit about your own kind of history with this particular movie, with the original Godzilla. Do you remember sort of when you first came to this movie? And I suppose just what do you think of this movie generally?
My first memory... So the first Godzilla movie I ever saw, I was probably like 5 years old, and I saw Godzilla versus King Kong on HBO at my grandparents' house, and that's what initially got me hooked. It's a pretty goofy movie, but as a kid, I really loved it. The original film, now of course, the version I first saw, and the version that most people that aren't from Japan first saw, was Godzilla King of the Monsters, the Americanized version. And that I saw... probably, again, around those ages of 8, 9, 10, because they used to show... my grandparents had they had one of those giant satellite dishes in their backyard, and it would pick up HBO. They didn't have to pay for it. It was great.
Amazing.
And so I would go out to their house. When I would be out visiting them, I would just sit inside all day, and I would watch Godzilla movies because they used to play them all the time. And that, I'm pretty sure, is where I first saw Godzilla King of the Monsters. And of course, I'd watch it over and over again through the years. And then when I was in college, and I might be getting some of these dates a little bit wrong because I'm trying to come up with these off the top of my head, but when I was in college, I believe is the first time that the original Gojira from Japan was released in the States. And that would have been the first time that I watched this version. I have always loved this movie. I like the American version quite a lot. It's a very different tone than the original, but it has its virtues, and of course I have a sentimental attachment to it. The first time that I saw the original Japanese, I was shocked. People... I sort of liken this to when people hear about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre,
right?
Familiar with horror. They're like, I'd never see that. It's going to be so bloody and gory and gross and all this. And it is gross, but people don't think of it as like an art film made by a bunch of like hippie college students, which is what it is. Yeah. It's very effective at what it does. And same with Godzilla. People think of Godzilla as being cheeseball, 50s, giant atomic monster, mindless, attacking cities. And as we talked about before, it's not that. And I think what amazed me so much about it is it feels almost surreal at times. Yeah. It feels almost like experimental with some of the ways that they shoot the underwater photography, with the music and the I mean, just even that opening title card where all you have is Godzilla's roar with the title, and then the music's like slowly coming in. And it's sort of like you're listening to like an operetta throughout this whole movie. Obviously, it has the story, it has a plot, and all that stuff's really interesting. But the choreography and the camera trickery and stuff that they use to evoke the fear of Godzilla, like destroying Tokyo, it's very symbolic It's all very purposeful and meaningful. There's my favorite shot in the whole movie. There's the really beautifully sad moment where we cut to a mother and her 2 kids.
Yeah.
And she says, you're going to see your father in heaven soon, basically. And then we cut back and we see them sitting and they're framed by like a bird cage. And Godzilla's like walking towards them. And it's this really beautiful moment of going like, wow, yeah, they're trapped. They're totally trapped.
Yeah. Like
there is nothing that they can do. And here's this mother doing anything she can to just comfort her children. The stuff, the special effects where he burns down, where Godzilla burns down the giant electric towers and they melt.
Yeah.
It's still super effective.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as effective as anything that you see in any of the like current legendary movies or anything. I just remember being really surprised by it and feeling like I was watching an art film instead of a movie about a giant monster.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I came to this similar sort of age, like in my 20s, the first time I actually saw this version. And yeah, again, just completely took me by surprise, just tonally, artistically. And, you mentioned, earlier, like how much this kind of franchise does kind of range in terms of its tone and its genres. And like you said, this is a kind of Criterion art horror film, isn't it? More than anything else. And that is kind of, I think it does always take people by surprise when they first come to it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about Ashiro Honda, the direction in this film. I mean, tell us a little bit about him and the way in which he kind of tackles this story.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. I mean, Ashiro Honda, so they went to him because he was kind of a journeyman director. He was, he had worked with Kurosawa. He had sort of worked with everybody. He was clearly very capable. He was also capable of working on a tight budget and on a tight time frame, which they had.
Right.
But he also was 2 things. One, he had a lot of experience with underwater photography because he'd done a lot of underwater documentaries, and they knew that this was going to have a lot of that. And he also, even though he had fought in the war, he was a vocal anti-war sort of protester. They had to fight, but he post-war was very vocally anti-war. And so those 2 things, combined with his just history with the studio, was a lot of the reasons why they went with him. I think his history or his experience doing documentaries shows through in this. I know that, like when you watch this movie, especially the scenes of Godzilla, the underwater stuff and the scenes of Godzilla destroying, especially Tokyo, but any time that you see Godzilla on screen, it feels very natural. It feels very real. It doesn't feel sensational, and that's echoed in the soundtrack, which obviously Honda oversaw. But I think that I think that his experience making documentaries, and I think the idea that he just completely understood this particular assignment of, we're trying to make this feel real, we're trying to evoke the horror of what happened to us, and we're trying to say we can never let it happen again.
Yeah.
And he took it seriously. Unlike, when you see a movie, and I'm not throwing trash on them, but like them, about the giant ants, that's a movie that you don't take seriously, right? And I love that movie. Yeah. It's a fun movie, but it's a movie where when they're filming these giant ants, they're supposed to be sensational, and you're supposed to be like sort of giggling and all that stuff. And the way that he shoots Godzilla is not at all. It's not that. It is it's very somber. It's very serious, and there's a very imminent threat. That I think is inherent in sort of every shot of this. And, then additionally with all the human actors, I mean, I love the scenes of like Dr. Yamane standing with the sort of council talking about like what to do. And you have this what feels to me very naturalistic exchange between all these different politicians and all these different scientists and all these different people, arguing in this bureaucratic fashion about this thing that is ultimately they can't do anything about. Ultimately they're completely useless. And I love Honda's direction in that. I feel like he gets to the heart of the people in this story, which is another thing that really sets it apart from most of these other types of films that would follow. Is where they stop caring as much about the people and more about, let's just see a bunch of destruction. or let's see more of the monster. And I'm not talking so much about the Godzilla franchise, but about, the Hollywood stuff that would follow. But I think that Honda understood that, ultimately it's the plight of the people and it's the failure of the government that is at the heart of all the problems that led to World War II. And those were the people that were affected by World War II. The bomb wasn't affected by World War II. The people were.
Yeah.
And so, I think he understood that at a very, base level, and he treated it seriously, and he treated it with respect, and he tried to, I think, evoke both the terror and the beauty of what the bomb, represented. It was a wild time, and I think that's why Godzilla just feels so enduring as a monster.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think you're right. There is that kind of really wonderful mix of like almost documentary realism, but then, like you say, kind of there's an art house almost vibe to it as well. That score is kind of haunting as well, isn't it?
It's
and again,
incredible.
not the kind of music that you might necessarily expect to accompany these big giant monster movies.
Yeah, it's not heroic. The score is not a heroic score.
No.
The score is to me, it's like on par with the Jaws score, right? Like when you hear the Jaws score come in, that the monster's coming, and maybe you're excited by it, but you're scared. And that's what that Ifukube score, it's this plodding, consistent. He's never gonna stop, and you can't stop him. That it's big, but it's because it carries weight.
Yeah.
And it was Ifukube himself that was the one that created the roar. The Godzilla's roar was from the composer. He dragged it was some kind of an electronic instrument across a cello string, and he was dragging them up and down on the cello string, and that's what created that. So the music in this movie is as integral part of the DNA of the film as anything.
No. Oh, look. A beauty mark. Pretty, isn't it? Oh, God. Please.
That was a little clip you heard just there from Brian Usner's squishy, squelchy classic from the 1980s, Society. That is one of the many movies that we are going to be screening live this year as part of Evolution of Horror Presents. Yes, we are going to be back around the UK hosting screenings and events at various different venues across the country. This weekend, if you're listening to this on the day the episode drops, we are going to be in Birmingham. That's Sunday the 19th of May, hosting a special 25th anniversary screening of The Rage Carrie 2, that 90s classic. That's going to be followed by a special panel discussion. That's going to be at the Mockingbird Cinema in Birmingham. Please do come and join us for that if you're in the area. We've got some great London events coming up as well over the next few weeks. Next week, we're going to be at the Regent Street Cinema in London to host an 80th anniversary screening of Gaslight from 1944. That's going to be a really fun screening and discussion. Then we are going to be in Manchester on the 13th of June for a 35th anniversary screening of Society. I cannot wait for that. It's going to be really fun to watch with an audience. We're going to be in Leeds a couple of days after that on the 15th of June, screening A Nightmare on Elm Street, Wes Craven's original masterpiece from 1984, celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. So that's going to be a special late night screening followed by a live podcast discussion on stage with special guests. And then we'll be back in London in June on the 19th to discuss William Castle's classic The Tingler from 1959. Now, my plan is to plant some electrodes in seats and give people some electric shocks throughout that movie. Let's see if we can make that happen. Tickets are on sale for all of these screenings in Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham and London, and we've got some more events and screenings screenings to announce very, very soon. So if you want to grab tickets for any of those events, head to evolutionofhorror.com/events. All of these screenings are going to be hosted by me and friends of the pod. All of them are going to be followed up by live podcast discussions on stage. We also open questions and comments to the audience. We love meeting you guys and chatting to you all. So please, if you can, come and join us at any of these events. And if you want to be kept up to date with other events happening throughout the year, sign up to our newsletter, evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter, and you will be the first to know when we announce new events, screenings happening in cities near you around the UK. evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter. Graeme, how do you find the first act of Godzilla? You know, that first 20 minutes is really powerful before we've even seen Godzilla on screen, right? But it's just this kind of relentless scenes of sort of devastation and destruction, isn't it? With these kind of fishing boats and these other attacks happening. And they really kind of let it simmer, let it build, don't they? Before we finally get that reveal of the monster about 20 minutes in, you know?
Yeah, and it's the confusion that I love about it, right? Nobody knows what's happening. Something horrible has happened to this boat. Of course, immediately people think atomic bomb, right?
Yeah.
Like immediately people think that. And so people are freaking out. But then you have the survivors that are saying it wasn't an atomic bomb, and they're saying it's something else, and that's where it starts getting this. That's where we really get into this horror territory of you know, imagine being those people that are going, well, it must be another atomic bomb thing. They're saying no, it's something else, but we don't really know what it is. A village gets destroyed out of nowhere.
Yeah,
I mean, people are in their homes, and it just gets crushed. Nobody knows what it is, and then an old man said it's Gojira, and it is a monster from the bottom of the sea. And of course, you know, then they go, and it's this combination of they find the giant footprint, they find the radiation levels are really high. You know, what the heck is this thing? And I think that's why it works so well in the build up to finally revealing what it is, and why we're so scared when we finally see it. You know, is that not only are we anticipating like, what could this thing possibly be? Because again, we have to put ourselves back in that time, right? Like, they're not immediately it's going to be a giant lizard, right? They're not immediately going, it's going to be this thing. This isn't a part of the cultural lexicon yet. So they're afraid of this thing. But then when we do see it, it's right there.
Yes.
It is at the top of a hill. And I love that moment so much because typically in these things, right, you expect it's going to be a giant monster is going to be walking in slowly from the horizon, you know, or you're going to see it towering over a building. No, I mean, it's like a jump scare. It's like this thing is suddenly like, hello,
hi,
you know, and he's right there, you know, and people suddenly, and they were running towards it.
Yeah.
All of a sudden they're having to run the other way. It's great, you know, and I also, I don't know, I find there are some people that talk about how the original Godzilla, like monster, the suit design, like looks a little goofy, and like, sure, like if we look at it through today's lens, like I can understand how that might look a little bit goofy, but I mean, at the time, again, it was a thing that one was not expected, and two, you know, unlike a stop motion creature, this was a real thing that was right there. And I think that ended up working in their favor, even though they I think were disappointed at the fact that they had to make it a guy in a suit. You know, I think that it ended up working in their favor to make it that much more frightening. Is that, yeah, this was a very tactile thing that was right there. And then the way Honda shoots it, I mean, it makes it feel like they're in the same frame.
I love it. Yeah. And this is something we were talking about a lot last week, of course, with King Kong, but there is something so breathtaking and magical and almost moving about seeing practical effects that are this old done so well, right? And I agree with you. I mean, some of the tricks that they pull off in this film, again, this kind of really high-risk stuff, right? Where they are running the film through the camera again, you know, doing two different compositions on the same film. So you've got Godzilla in the background and people running in the foreground. And it was all very high risk because it could all go catastrophically wrong, right? But it looks incredible.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, and like you said, I like that you mentioned it was high risk. I mean, some of the stuff, in fact, I think it was that shot of that first shot of Godzilla.
Yeah.
You know, if they screwed that up, because they couldn't like watch it, right? They couldn't watch, you know, like dailies were delays would happen, but they were on such a tight shooting schedule, they didn't really have time to go back and fix a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And so, like, if they hadn't filmed that exactly right, then that moment wasn't going to work. And the movie hinges so much on that moment. So, I mean, this was true, like maybe not guerrilla filmmaking, but it was intense, and it required a whole lot of finesse and a whole lot of bravery.
Right. And they did talk about doing stop motion, didn't they, in the way that King Kong did, but I think they realized that it would have taken them months, possibly years longer in order to, make that happen.
They didn't have the time and they didn't have the money. It was just going to take way too long because for whatever reason, Toho had like a time slot in I want to say December of that year. And so and they started filming because the Lucky Dragon 5 incident happened in March of 54.
So quick, right? So quick.
It was so fast.
Yeah.
And so, Tanaka, he had the idea after that happened. And so I want to say they were filming by like July, and so then they had to film this whole thing in less than a month. And piece it all together, get the score made, get everything done in order to have it able to release by that time slot. And so stop motion was totally out, and so of course they're thinking, well, what can we, how do we solve this problem? And they said, well, let's put a stuntman in a suit and let's have it be a guy in a suit.
Yeah.
And poor Haruo Nakajima, man, he went through hell. He's who played Godzilla.
Yeah.
And he went through hell. I mean, this suit was weighed well over 200 pounds. It would fill up with water whenever he was in the water, which made it like doubly heavy. It was, apparently it was pretty awful. So respect to Nakajima for still bringing life to such an enduring character with all those restrictions.
Well, yeah, let's talk about Godzilla, shall we? Because I think there's something so fascinating about the creature itself in this and the way we feel towards it. Because it is this big, destructive monster. We do see it kill hundreds, if not thousands of people. And yet, is there something kind of sympathetic about Godzilla, right? That he is this creature that was disturbed and woken up, and I don't know, it's just kind of doing what it's doing, like any animal does in a weird way. I don't know, and I think the film kind of pulls off that balance quite cleverly in the way that Godzilla is realized on screen as well. What are your thoughts on, I guess, the performance, right, of Godzilla as the monster in this film?
Yeah, good question. I agree. I think that part of it is the design. Godzilla has these big eyes.
Yeah.
We obviously connect with characters through their eyes. Godzilla looks, not super vicious. He looks like a giant lizard that is, that's been woken up. And I think coupled with Dr. Yamane being so vocal about saying, like, this is just a creature that has been woken up that is doing what it's doing. We're the ones that are shooting bullets at it.
Yeah.
And so I think that, we do get this sense of like a sympathy for Godzilla. Now, that's part of what's so fascinating about the themes of this movie is that at the same time, we have a sympathy and a respect for this monster that's destroying Tokyo. He's also destroying Tokyo.
Right.
And so do they have to stop Godzilla? Yeah, they do. And it's a really sad thing because, like you said, mankind is what woke it up. But mankind's now got to, it feels like, if you were to go into a cave and wake up a bear that was minding its own business, bear wakes up, bear sees an intruder, bear comes after you, you've got to kill the bear.
Yeah.
You've effectively just murdered a bear.
Yeah.
And so I think there's like an inherent, and it's evident in the film. I mean, the film treats it this way. The film treats it with the sadness that we have to resort to this. And I think thematically that ties in a lot with sort of, and again, I'm by no means an expert on Japanese history, or Japanese, cultural history, but that's a part of what the Japanese are struggling with in the wake of World War II was this idea of we are so tragically sad at what has happened to us with the destruction of Tokyo and of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but we also brought it upon ourselves. And so, where does the blame lie? And maybe the blame lies with everyone, and maybe the blame lies with just humanity itself and how human beings are. And I think that that's kind of what they're struggling with in this movie is, they're mad at Godzilla, but they also understand why Godzilla did this thing because we're attacking Godzilla, just as Japan on some level, because a lot of Japan did not agree with being involved in the war. They didn't want to be a part of it, but the government did.
Yeah.
Right? And so a lot of Japan is going, this is horrible what the Americans did to us, but we also got ourselves into this situation.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to grasp. And one of the only ways that we can really grasp those hard questions is through art. And that's what this movie does.
Right. And I actually love the way in which the characters kind of represent the different kind of sides of the discussion and debate surrounding this kind of thing, like war and death. And, you've got this character who is this kind of, as we've mentioned, this kind of older patriarchal character who is this kind of more a biologist or a kind of animal lover who doesn't want to hurt Godzilla. His daughter, who is kind of really the heart of the film, right? It feels like, she reacts to things in the way that we might react to things. And then she's got these two suitors, right? This kind of, it's kind of like a love triangle type situation here, isn't it? I think,
it's a little bit of a love triangle.
Yeah. And so you've got this character who is her, current partner, Ogata, right, who is much more kind of, he's a little bit more military, he's a little bit like pro, let's kill the monster. And then you've got her ex, this kind of almost like mad scientist type archetype, right, who's really struggling morally with his invention that could kill the monster but could have devastating consequences on the world. So between these three characters and this woman's father, you've got all these different kind of sides of the debate, and there is a lot of kind of inner turmoil and kind of tension, as well as kind of the big spectacle in this film,
Oh yeah, I mean, there's that great scene with Ogata and Yamane when they visit her father, when they visit Dr. Yamane, and they're in his house and they're having dinner, and Ogata, sort of says his position, and Yamane kicks him out. He's like, get out of my house. And it's really, and that's partly what drives Yamane to go and see Serizawa, to sort of be like, it's an interesting dynamic, because I think you don't often, especially at that time, you don't often see a movie about, a woman, her current boyfriend, but then she's also going to advice from her previous boyfriend.
Yes.
And there's like the sort of ethical or moral, at the time, like, ooh, that's kind of scandalous. You have Serizawa, who more or less tells Yamane, like, I want nothing to do with this. Like, I wish you'd never come and see me. I don't want them to find out about what I've done. And he finally shows her, and I love the way that Honda shoots it, because we don't see what it is. She just screams.
Yeah.
He watches with this like serious like sadness, and she just screams.
Yeah.
And of course, it all comes out, what he has and what he's able to do. But yeah, I think that, when people say that Godzilla films aren't about the characters at all, like, this movie can't exist without sort of that quartet of characters and their different viewpoints that are clashing in how to respond to this thing, because that's at the heart of the themes of this movie, right? Like we just said, it's about knowing this thing should be able to survive, this thing should be able to live and do its thing, but it is also destroying us, and we have to protect ourselves. Yeah. This is a no-win situation, and it's that no-win situation that I think the Americans struggled with when they were trying to release this in America, because we love to win stuff, right? We love to defeat the monster.
Yeah.
And the original Japanese film, it feels like nobody wins.
Absolutely.
Which is
sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, which I think is how they felt at the end of World War II, that nobody won.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And I think that moment at the end, it doesn't feel triumphant, right? When they kill Godzilla, it feels sad. It doesn't feel like, air punch kind of a moment.
Yeah.
But that's what's interesting, and we'll talk about this a bit later when we talk about what comes after this film. But the way in which this character in this franchise almost fractures into two separate halves, it feels like. I mean, you are more up on this than me, but from what I've known and what I've seen, it's like you've got the big fantasy fun monsters hitting each other, military versus the monster kind of spectacle, and then you've got the Godzilla minus ones, the Shin Godzillas, that are more about what this actually means to humanity and the people and the emotion and the bureaucracy and the politics, and these Godzilla movies kind of constantly go in one direction or the other, it feels like.
Yeah. I mean, and we can talk about that. Like, the arc of this whole franchise is really fascinating, and there's definitely there's a pattern to it that I'm excited to talk about. But yeah, no, I agree, but it always those patterns always end up going back to resetting to what this original film did, which was really trying to make a statement about something and do it in an artistic in an artistic way through horror, which is what I think the best horror does.
And there are, what I also really appreciated about this movie, we've got our core characters, and then of course you've got the countless other characters that are in these big kind of ensemble scenes of kind of mass devastation and that kind of thing. But what I really love is this movie does take a bit of time to kind of give us a little bit of these characters too. Like you've already mentioned, the mother with her two daughters, or characters having a conversation on a bus, or the fishermen or villagers that then come back later. And I don't know, it feels like these characters actually do get their moments as well, don't they? They're not just fodder, in these kind of big scenes. I think that's a really important part of this movie too, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Great observation. I mean, I think of, there's a scene where we have, this couple on a date on like a little like mini cruise ship that's out in the bay, and we're sitting with them for like a while, like hearing them have a conversation and talking about what they're going to do and all this stuff, and then of course Godzilla appears. But it's because we're sitting with them and because he gives us just enough time to start to care.
Yeah.
Same with like the people on the bus, or the I think it's the whatever, the above ground train. It's like people, he gives us just enough time to start to care a little bit about them and to see that these are people with lives.
Yeah.
In almost all of those scenes, they are talking about something they're going to do, what they're going to do later that day, what they're going to do tomorrow. And then of course Godzilla destroys those plans. And I think that's what makes us, I think that's what resonates with us, right? Is that we all, you have something you're going to go do after this. I have something I'm going to do after this. We never think this is going to be our last moment. And for these people, it is.
Yeah.
And, like that mother with the two kids, the way that we've been establishing these characters, it subconsciously makes us think back to that mom and her two kids, and like how earlier that day, everything was fine.
Yeah.
And now here we are saying goodbye to the world. It's really affecting, and it's a testament to the movie making that we do care enough about these people that when they're dead, we feel it.
We feel it, yeah. It's not just about the spectacle, although the spectacle is great, right? I mean, like, those kind of, how do you find those kind of major set pieces in the movie, the big attack on Tokyo and that kind of thing? Like, how well, 70 years old, right, this year, this movie is, but how well do you think those scenes hold up?
Oh, I mean, phenomenal. He's very judicious in what he shows. He only shows us the stuff that he can totally pull off really, really well. He doesn't have, Godzilla doing, and part of this, was probably because Nakajima just couldn't move around very well in that suit, but he didn't have Godzilla like doing flying kicks and knocking over buildings. This is a big, lumbering, just unstoppable monster. The atomic breath, is interesting because it, in this movie, it really comes across as like smoke coming out of his mouth, but it's the effect of the breath. It's seeing those towers melting that you go, oh wow, like that didn't look super scary, but holy shit, like this is a dangerous thing that he has. And same with the miniature work is incredible. The way that they match the Tokyo, cityscape in these miniatures, where they cut from people actually on the street to Godzilla behind him. I mean, there's a great double exposure shot of Godzilla when he's first sort of walking up on the electric towers and the people are running away from him, and it's totally seamless.
Yeah,
you really just can't tell. And I take myself back to 54, and I think of myself like watching this movie in a theater, and it had to have been terrifying.
Yeah.
When you see something that's like a stop motion creature, even back then, it's not real, right? There's a certain suspension of disbelief. There's a certain element of I'm aware that this is, that I'm watching a movie, but when you see this and you see this thing that is clearly organic, that looks to be, hundreds of feet tall, that is right here next to these people that I also know are real. It's a striking image.
It really is. I think those images really hold up, don't they? All right, well, finally, let's finish with the way this movie concludes then. We've mentioned it briefly a couple of times already, but, the moment when they do set off this oxygen destroyer in the ocean, it's quite a kind of powerful moment, isn't it? It's kind of sad, it's exciting, it's dramatic. And, as you mentioned, there's that great moment earlier on, this kind of tease where they test out the oxygen destroyer in a fish tank and we don't see what it does. We just see Emiko's kind of, expression of horror, right? Her reaction to it. This is where we see the weapon actually kind of carried out. We destroy Godzilla. What do you think of the way in which this film kind of wraps up and those final scenes in the movie?
Yeah, I think they're really beautifully done. I think that one, the fact that we have gotten to know these human characters so well, and the fact that it is Ogata and Serizawa that are having to go down together to go and do this thing. It's interesting because, like we've been talking about, people are, one, there's a sadness that we're going to have to do this to Godzilla at all. Mm-hmm. Two, there's a fear that I think one character even says, like, well, is this going to stay contained to Tokyo Bay? Are we going to kill all life in the ocean? Like, what is this going to do? They don't know the extent that this weapon has. And so when they are going to use it, there's that fear of, like, we might be about to destroy the world. Yeah. We don't know, which of course also echoes the atomic bomb. Yeah. It might ignite the atmosphere. We don't think it'll happen, but it might. Mm-hmm. But then you have Yamane with essentially your two boyfriends, and both of them are about to go down into the water with Godzilla and do this thing. Now, the thing about this scene that I think that really hits me when I see it is when they go down there, Godzilla's asleep.
Yeah, it's that moment. Yeah,
he's asleep, and that tells me two things. One, it tells me they're sneaking up on a sleeping creature to, sucker punch it, basically. Yeah. But also that Godzilla sleeps. Godzilla is an organic, he's not some supernatural being. Mm-hmm. He's not, he is an organic creature that has to get some rest. Yeah. He has to sleep. And he's so vulnerable. Yeah. And so innocent in that moment. And here we are going down there saying, all right, quick, kill it before it wakes up. Yeah. And it's sad. It's really sad, and then of course, then you couple all of that with the layer of Serizawa not wanting anybody to know about his invention. Yeah. And so he's going to sacrifice himself. He cuts his own line. Yeah. Like that whole scene of them like pulling up the line going, oh my God, he's cut his own line, and they realize what he's done. Mm-hmm. It's and then of course, those final moments of Godzilla thrashing around, and you see Godzilla in pain. Yeah. And you see Godzilla, obviously, like, it gives you, it's like, you've suddenly thrown acid on a sleeping animal. Right. And this animal's waking up going, I don't know what's going on. This animal didn't know anything about what was going on. All it knew was there were these things attacking it, and it woke up and it went and it was taking care of the problem. Then I got to go sleep. Oh my God. I'm waking up and I'm burning alive. Yeah. It's very sad. And the music that's playing and the look of everybody on the ship that are watching this happen, I think they're all realizing it at the same time. Yeah. Of what they've done and what they had to do. And so the end of the film, it's super impactful, and it has all these complex layers of, they didn't want to do it, but they did have to do it. And we as an audience are going, well, we don't want you to do it, but we know that you have to do it. Yeah. And it doesn't answer any of those questions. Like we said, there is no winner. There's no winner. It's
something, I found that really interesting about this movie too, in the way, yes, this is the movie that kind of launched the big atomic monster movie, but there is also something about it that, I'm kind of discussing it on this podcast in a whole series of movies that I'm kind of basing around sort of nature and messing with nature. And, a lot of those are kind of your more standard animal attack movies, The Birds, Jaws, And I think there is something of that to Godzilla too, right? Like, yes, he's not a real animal, but there is something in the world of this movie, like you said, he is this organic living thing that has been disturbed, right? I mean, that's actually all he is in this original movie, really, which is, again, like, kind of, there are also kind of those interesting themes of just the way in which we're fucking up the planet, right, with what we're doing with these atomic bombs and everything else, right? There is a kind of eco kind of message also to this movie, I think, you know?
Oh, yeah, Godzilla is a white blood cell for the planet. You know, Godzilla is...
Right.
That's what he is. And he, like you said, I mean, he hasn't come through a dimensional portal, you know?
Right.
He hasn't, like, come down from outer space. He wasn't...
Yeah.
You know, he was not a lizard or an iguana that was radiated by radiation. People still think that Godzilla was some like lizard that was irradiated and turned giant. That is not what happened. Godzilla was a thing that was asleep, that was woken up by the hydrogen bomb being blown off. And it's I'm glad that you're including Godzilla in this series, because you're right. It is the whole point of Godzilla is that Godzilla is a real animal, a real creature that over the course of this whole series functions as, like I said, as a white blood cell for when humans start meddling too much, or when outside forces of any kind, maybe those are monsters, start meddling too much. Godzilla is the one that's on the job. And so, but the main point is always have respect for the monster, because the minute we stop respecting the monster, the minute we stop respecting Earth, the Earth can get rid of us in a minute.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
That we are not in charge. And I think that's the point of this whole franchise.
This is an heart attack.
It's morphin' time.
This is an heart attack.
Who's ready? Who loves orange sauce?
To me.
This is incredible game.
Because I am addicted to podcasting, obviously, and because clearly there's just not enough of my voice out there in the world, you may or may not be aware that I have another podcast running at the moment called Zap to the Future. Now, in some ways, it could not be more different to the evolution of horror, because this is about kids' television, specifically kids' TV of the 90s. Me and my friend James Payne, who you may know as one of the co-hosts from Journey Through Sci-Fi, got together to make a limited 10-episode mini-season that dives back into the TV shows of our childhood. Each week, we cover a different genre of kids' television. We've done everything from sitcoms like Kenan and Kel and Saved by the Bell, to animations like Ren and Stimpy and Hey Arnold, to game shows like Gladiators and The Incredible Games. And in this week's episode, I thought it was apt to plug it on the podcast, because this week's episode is all about spooky kids' horror of the 90s. So it's a really fun discussion in this week's episode, in which James and I talk about Round the Twist, Goosebumps, Are You Afraid of the Dark, Moomin, Count Duckula, and a whole bunch of other small screen kids classics. So if you want to check it out, there are 9 of the 10 episodes out right now, so you can give it a little binge listen. It's called Zap to the Future. That's Zap with 3 Z's, and you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. I will also link to it in the show notes. So, Graeme, let's talk a little bit about what happened after Godzilla was released. First of all, how well was it received? Was it a kind of smash hit instantly?
Yeah, it was huge.
Yeah.
It was a huge film. I mean, there's a reason why the Americans immediately wanted to pick it up and release it. Yeah, it was huge. And you know, it was one of those things that just immediately captured the cultural zeitgeist, and immediately was the biggest film of the year.
Yeah.
And the Americans, you know, which is when Hollywood wants to bring your movie stateside, that's kind of your sign that things have gone very well for you.
Yeah.
And Hollywood was on the phone with them like immediately. I mean, they released this movie in the States like months after it came out in Japan, which, you know, at the time was, I mean, that happens all the time now, but at the time that wasn't always so common.
So let's talk about Godzilla King of the Monsters then, which is the kind of American sort of recut, I guess, would you call it, of Godzilla?
Yeah, it's kind of a recut. So basically what they did was they were concerned that Americans, one, might be bored with all the reading not with the reading because they dubbed it over, but that they would be bored with the long stretches of silence, with the long, that they were like, Americans need more action. And two, they were concerned that Americans weren't going to know what was going on, that they were going to be confused. So they decided they were going to drop in an American character of a news reporter that was going to sort of narrate the movie to us and tell us not just what was happening, but how we were supposed to be feeling.
A prehistoric monster the Japanese call Godzilla has just walked out of Tokyo Bay. He's as tall as a 30-story building. Now he's making his way toward the city's main line of defense. 300,000 volts of electricity strung around the city is a barrier against Godzilla. I can hardly believe what has just happened. Now it seems Tokyo has no defense.
The studio had very little faith that Americans were going to have any idea what to think about this movie. So they dropped in the actor Raymond Burr, who was very famous at the time. And the way that they did it was actually really interesting. They did a whole bunch of reshoots with Raymond Burr, where they reconstructed not just the sets, many of the sets where they were going to put him, but also like the lighting, like they recreated things exactly so that they could have this new character standing in the same room that we were seeing all these other characters in, except we would just like cut to a corner of the room and there's Raymond Burr standing
right
there.
Yeah,
and we cut back and we see but it feels very fluid. It feels very natural. Like they actually did a really good job with it. The tone of it's a little bit more gung-ho. It's a little bit more we're gonna, they're talking about how to destroy the creature and all that stuff, but it doesn't go as far as honestly you would kind of think it would. Like even at the end when they're destroying Godzilla, even though he's describing, it's just really funny to me, the idea of it needing feeling like you need a character to explain to the audience how they should be feeling is like just really interesting to me. Like I can sort of understand like if you think they're not going to be following the plot, like saying, well, we gotta, I guess what like Ridley Scott kind of did that in Blade Runner, right? Like you throw some narration in there and it kind of helps. It's just interesting because he is kind of telling us at the end that we should be feeling sad for the monster. He's understanding of the idea that we are destroying this thing that is a beautiful creation of the earth, but that we have to do it out of self-defense. And I kind of read that a little bit as almost an American version of the, hey, we know we dropped the bomb, but it was to stop the war, and I don't know how overt that was. I really think that the studio was just trying to like make sure that Americans understood what was going on and like didn't walk out of the theater. Plus they wanted to have an American star in there to like draw people to the theater.
Well, and that's interesting because I was going to ask whether or not this recut American version kind of let America off the hook a little bit more, because I know they cut certain scenes from the original. For example, the scene on the bus where a woman actually overtly mentions Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They've removed that from the American version, right? And how much of this movie is America, I guess, kind of removing anything that might put the blame on them as to what is going on here,
Yeah, I mean, they definitely softened the blow. They for sure, they like you mentioned that scene. I'm having a hard time remembering exactly what all the scenes that were cut, but it's stuff like that where they talk about specifically, the horrors of. Because at one point I think somebody talks about the firebombing of Tokyo. I think certainly they talk about dropping the bomb. But like early on, I think maybe even somebody mentions like, oh, did the Americans drop another bomb? And I think that they may have shifted some of that language a little bit in the dub. And so it's I mean they softened the blow. I think that the main thing was they didn't want the Americans to look too much like the bad guy, and I think that they wanted to still keep intact I believe that they still took care, especially through that last scene with the ultimate nobody wins idea, which I'm actually like really happy about, because it would have been very easy to leave this on a big patriotic like we killed him note, and they don't do that. But at the same time, they sugarcoat stuff, they gloss over some of the kind of facts of things. So it's different. I don't mind it. The original is inherently better. I do want to touch on something that's always something that I find interesting, and that I is sort of a thing that sticks in my gullet a little bit.
Yeah.
So the Godzilla versus Gojira, right?
Yes.
There is so the original name for the monster is Gojira, and that is a portmanteau of the Japanese word gorira, which means gorilla, and the Japanese word kujira, which means whale. So it's a gorilla whale is what the name is.
Yeah.
And in kanji, in Japanese alphabet, those letters work a little bit differently than ours do. Ours are just like a sound, and theirs is they each letter has like a different. It's more like a word. Each letter is more like a word. So in Japanese, there's 3 characters that make up the name Gojira. There's go, and then there's ji, and then there's ra. Right? Go, ji, ra. No, go is go. But when basically when the Americans were going to do it, they basically asked Toho. They said, "So what the hell do we call this thing? What does Gojira mean?" And they were like, "Well, you can call it a gorilla whale. That's dumb. What is the name?" And so they gave literally what the American translation of Gojira would be, which is you have go, and then you have it's not exactly G, it's more like C, like a TSE, like C.
Right.
Go C. And then Ra. But of course, when an American says an L sound, it's an R sound in Japan, and vice versa. So they reversed it, and they said a Ra would be La. So it's Godzilla.
Right.
So it's literally the same thing. Like that came straight from Toho.
Yeah.
When people called it, it's not a problem to call the original film Gojira, because that is the name of the film.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was some back and forth with me in the book, because as the first chapter of the book, I had it as Godzilla because it's coming out for, English-speaking audiences primarily.
Yeah.
But they wanted a Gojira, which of course I was fine with. Toho couldn't do whatever they want.
Yeah.
But then I think in the final version, I think it went back to Godzilla to be listed as the original title. So it's to me, they're interchangeable. To me, it's a little bit like if I'm, if you or I were saying like, hey, I'm going to go spend spring break in Paris. It was done a little weird, right? We're going to Paris.
Yeah.
And and so, and even Toho, I mean, all the films that followed, they just call it Godzilla. It's no longer Gojira. They pronounce it Gojira.
Yeah.
Because that's how they pronounce Godzilla. But it's the same word. So they're the same thing, but the word Godzilla came about initially because Americans just didn't know what the heck to call a monster.
I love that. Interesting. And I guess that happens, doesn't it? I always think of Ring, which is kind of spelt Ringu, right? And some people call it Ringu, and some people just call it Ring, and it's kind of both are valid, right? I think. And,
it's all the same thing. Yeah.
But nobody can stop the great showdown when King Kong and Godzilla meet to fight for survival of the fittest.
Let's talk a little bit about what came afterwards, because obviously this movie kind of launched a genre in a sense, right? Kaiju. Tell us a little bit about what that means. Kaiju, a kaiju movie,
A lot of people have different definitions of kaiju. A kaiju is basically a giant monster. Or sometimes people include like giant mechs as kaiju, sort of anything that's a giant destructive being. Could be a kaiju. Now, I am of the camp that I think if you were a kaiju, I think that you need to be Japanese in origin, either created by the Japanese, like by a Japanese film company, like they created you, or you were coming from the Sea of Japan, or you're coming from Japan somewhere.
Yeah. So you can't just be like Cloverfield, for example, or something like that.
And like some people say, like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man is a kaiju,
right?
Now, look, that's also valid. Kaijus don't exist, so they could be whatever the hell we want, and maybe it's more fun to say the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man is a kaiju, and that's fine. I tend to be of the camp that it needs to be Japanese in origin, but that's basically what it is. Is a kaiju is like Godzilla or like any of the monsters that it ends up facing is a giant destructive creature. And some of them can be robots, like I would consider Jet Jaguar, who's a robotic character that comes in later in the series, to be a kaiju.
Right. Yep.
But so I don't know that they necessarily need to be organic, but anything that's very, very large, at least the size of a building, and is somehow destructive in nature, I think is a kaiju.
So there are tons and tons and tons of movies that followed Godzilla, right? And you've got things like King Kong versus Godzilla in 1962, and you've got Mothra and these other kind of characters. And you've broken down in your book, like you've kind of categorized them into different kind of eras, right? Tell us a little bit about that, about the kind of the different eras of this kind of series, I suppose.
Yeah. So there is. So the first sequel was Godzilla Raids Again, and that came out less than a year after the first one. So the first one was such a huge hit, they immediately put a sequel into the works. And then we had like another 7 or 8 years before another Godzilla film, but that was King Kong versus Godzilla. And that really kind of saved the franchise because Godzilla was kind of fading into obscurity. It had been these 2 movies that had come out real quick and they were big hits, and then it just kind of went away. And I honestly think a part of that was because then throughout the 50s, you had this glut of copycats in Hollywood that were coming out. And so I think people were getting tired of atomic monster movies. So Godzilla movies weren't being made. But then Toho got the rights to King Kong. And originally it was going to be King Kong versus Frankenstein. And they were thinking about that, and I believe there was some hiccup with getting the rights to Frankenstein or something, or to the Universal Frankenstein. And so then somebody had the bright idea saying, well, we have another green monster, and so King Kong versus Godzilla came out in 1962. That is another one where the American version is very, very different from the Japanese version. The Criterion disc that came out a few years ago, I had only ever seen the American version, which I like, but it's very goofy and it doesn't really land. And it's weird because it's like inherently goofy, and like neither Godzilla nor King Kong look very good in the movie. And the battles aren't that great, but it takes itself really seriously. I was shocked because when I watched the Japanese version, it leans hard into the comedy. It is like watching a cartoon, and it works so much better because you don't take anything seriously. It doesn't take itself seriously. It's making a big statement. Honda directed that one too, but it's making a big statement about consumerism and about the commercial industry.
So it's kind of like the Dawn of the Dead of
100%. Yes, 100%. But it's leaning really. It makes the whole thing kind of a farce.
Right.
And so anyway, highly recommend checking out the Japanese version of King Kong vs. Godzilla if you haven't. But then, King Kong vs. Godzilla, I mean, it was like the Avengers of movies. It was a massive, massive blockbuster. Everybody went to see it. And then that launched us into, that really launched us into the first era, which is the Showa era. Now the eras, the first couple of eras, the Showa and the Heisei era, were, they're just labeled that after the emperor that was reigning over Japan at the time. So the Showa era, it goes all the way up through Terror of Mechagodzilla, which was Honda's last film to direct for the franchise, and also Nakajima's last appearance as Godzilla. They wanted to, and Ifukube's last time doing the score. They all wanted to kind of be together to do, their last kind of outing with Godzilla. And the Showa era has a really, after King Kong versus Godzilla, they started, they recognized that bringing in popular characters was something that people loved, so that's why they brought in Mothra. Mothra had her whole own franchise that she was a big hit in, so they brought in Mothra. Same with Rodan, even though Rodan never gets his own like Rodan versus Godzilla movie. Rodan was another very famous monster series that had been going on at the same time. So then they bring in Rodan. Ghidorah is a new entrant into this. But they started then realizing that people loved seeing these characters come back. Now in Mothra versus Godzilla, Godzilla's still the bad guy, right? And Mothra's the good guy in this. But then when Godzilla versus the three-headed monster, when Ghidorah arrives, Ghidorah is such a horrible threat to the planet that then Godzilla becomes the savior of humanity, and that's when we see the shift into Godzilla being a good guy,
right?
And that's when we start seeing Godzilla teaming up with his friends, with Mothra, with Anguirus, to team up to sort of fight these new problems that start to arise. And they get really goofy. They start leaning more heavily. They wanted to get the families into theater, wanting to get kids into theater. Like as we all know, like with horror, like a PG-13 horror movie makes more money than an R-rated one does. So they wanted to start to get families in there. So about halfway through, and I don't have the timeline directly in front of me, I should, but they make Destroy All Monsters. Now, Destroy All Monsters is definitely one of the best Godzilla movies. And the thing with that one was they were convinced that the franchise was dying. Things were slowing down. The box office wasn't doing as well. Sort of in a similar story to, I don't know how much of a video gamer you are, but the story behind the game Final Fantasy, where they thought that, Square was like, well, we have, we can't do anything else. We're going to go down. So let's make one Final Fantasy. And of course, it kept the studio alive. Same with Destroy All Monsters. They said, let's make one last one. Let's bring in every monster he's ever fought. Let's have them all fight together, do a big brawl, and it'll be a hell of a way to go out. And then they do, and of course, it's a gigantic hit.
Love that.
And people just go nuts.
And that was 1968, so kind of in the middle of
68,
that period.
Yeah. So then it reinvigorated the franchise, and then we have a whole slew of other films after that. But through Terror of Mechagodzilla, which is actually a really great film, and one of the most pure horror. It's one of the only Godzilla movies with blood in it.
Wow.
And it's the only Godzilla movie with nudity in it. So I really highly recommend that one, especially for horror fans. If you want to find a Godzilla movie that's more pure horror, mad scientist kind of stuff, Terror of Mechagodzilla is very, very good. Like I said, it's Honda returning to the franchise, so you can't go wrong with that. And then you have a break. So then after that, they they wrapped it up. They said, okay, we're going to take a break. And then the 80s begin, and we start to get fears of communism. We start to get fears of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons are back on the horizon. There's all sorts of new biological weapons that are starting to bubble around. And Toho says it's time to bring back Godzilla to address this stuff. And so then you have Godzilla 1984, aka The Return of Godzilla. And The Return of Godzilla is a great movie. The movies throughout the Showa era, they got consistently more and more and more silly and fun and outrageous, and there were aliens and robots and all that stuff. Return of Godzilla brings it right back to where it was. Godzilla's scary. Godzilla is now he is a guy in a suit, but he's also an animatronic because the technology has improved, and it's a pretty harrowing film. It's pretty intense, and so they just brought it right back to Godzilla being the bad guy, and it works. They do a pure horror film. I really love the Heisei era. The Heisei era, it ran from 84 to 95, and the immediately following Return of Godzilla is Godzilla versus Biollante, which is sadly extremely hard to find. It's out of print pretty much everywhere. Copyright issues with all these films are really fascinating because it's something to do with how in Japan, and again, I'm not an expert, so don't come at me, but my understanding is that in Japan, the rights to specific films lie not just with the studio, but also with the director.
Right.
And so they kind of have to work together to have these come out. And so for whatever reason, Godzilla versus Biollante, it's very hard to find. I mean, the only Blu-ray I was able to find is some Polish bootleg.
Oh wow!
That's what I have. But then you basically have in the Heisei era a revamp of the major characters from you get King Ghidorah back, you get Mothra back, you get Mechagodzilla back. Those are kind of the big three. They introduced Space Godzilla, which is another really fun movie.
That sounds incredible. Yeah.
It's really, really fun. Basically, cells from Godzilla somehow go through a black hole and get transformed, and then Space Godzilla comes back.
Amazing.
And they also reintroduce Minilla. We never talked about Son of Godzilla, which is one of the goofier entries of the Showa era. Not my favorite movie, but there's a certain charm to it. Minilla is not technically the actual son of Godzilla, by the way. Minilla is just an egg found with a Godzilla baby and a Godzilla type baby, and Godzilla raises him.
Do we know, is Godzilla male or female? Do we know that?
I can tell you this, Godzilla, because I had this discussion, and I have a hard time because I'm just so used to saying Godzilla's a male.
Yeah.
So in my book, I gendered Godzilla as male throughout the whole thing.
Yeah.
And Toho, when they came back with their notes, one of the main notes they gave me was that Godzilla is neither male nor female, that Godzilla is a force of nature. Godzilla is an it. Mm-hmm. So they said, a hurricane is neither male nor female. An earthquake is neither male nor female.
Right.
So Godzilla is technically an it. And again, it's hard because we have King of the Monsters, but that was, again, a thing that the Americans created. The Americans put the label king on it.
Yeah.
So technically Godzilla's an it. But
Interesting.
I have a hard. It's just so ingrained in my DNA to
Of course.
say he. You know.
Of course. Yeah.
My favorite movie in the whole franchise after the original is the last movie of the Heisei era. It's called Godzilla vs. Destroyer.
1995. Yeah.
95. Yeah. It's a remarkable movie. It's essentially about so for whatever reason, Godzilla has sucked up all this energy and is now about to explode. Godzilla has built up all this atomic energy and is now like literally like on fire. Similarly, you have in this one they call him Godzilla Jr. They've got Godzilla Jr., who's like the baby Godzilla, who's not Godzilla's son, but is Godzilla's kind of nephew, sort of. And Godzilla Jr. is also sort of in play. And then we find out that the oxygen destroyer from the original film, that it left behind these particles. They have now evolved to become these little bugs. They break out, they evolve, and then they become Destroyer, which is the word for the monster that came out from the oxygen destroyer. But the really tragic thing about it is that they decide that the only way to they want to pit Godzilla versus Destroyer because Godzilla can destroy Destroyer, and Destroyer can also destroy Godzilla, because if Godzilla explodes, Godzilla could destroy the whole world. Right. So they want to pit them together, but they can't get Godzilla to go. They can't just say, Godzilla, go fight Destroyer. So they have to psychically guide Godzilla Jr. to Destroyer into harm's way to get Godzilla to follow. I won't tell you what happens because it gets very emotional.
Wow.
But it's a remarkable movie. It's the only one of these movies that I cry out when I watch it. So highly recommend that one.
Yeah.
Anyway, then we go into the Millennium Era, and that was obviously so named because it was the new millennium. They had Godzilla 2000, which came out in 99. It's not my favorite of the franchise, but it again resets it. Godzilla's a bad guy. This is the era where every single one of the films is on its own timeline, with the exception of Godzilla against Mechagodzilla and Godzilla Tokyo SOS. Those connect. Those are two movies in a sequence.
Yeah.
And then the 50th anniversary of the franchise is with Godzilla Final Wars, which was in 2004. Absolutely bug nuts, insane movie. It's got every single monster Godzilla's ever fought.
Amazing.
It's even got the American Godzilla from '98, which has a fantastic, hilarious cameo where Godzilla okay, I gotta just mention this.
Yeah.
In Godzilla Final Wars, so the whole point was to have him fight every single monster he's ever fought. And Godzilla 98 had come out. Of course, the Japanese hated it. So the only CGI monster in Godzilla Final Wars is the Godzilla from 98. They have that. It's the only CGI character, and he pops up. I think it's in Sydney, and our Godzilla goes up against him and immediately dispatches him. Like, no problem, no fight, just bam, he's done.
Yeah.
And Rie Kitamura said, that was essentially just a fuck you to the 98 Godzilla. It's like, we don't like you.
Love that.
So it's great. So then we are currently in the Reiwa era. And the Reiwa era doesn't have a ton of movies in it. It started with Shin Godzilla, 2016, brilliant film. And then we have the 3 Netflix anime movies, which are sort of a varying quality in my opinion, but they're very pretty to look at. The last one, the Planet Eater, is the one that I like the most. And then, of course, Godzilla -1, which came out last year, which is an absolute masterpiece.
Oscar winning, right? Like
Oscar winning,
Oscar-winning Godzilla movie.
It's really remarkable, and it's a movie that, again, it's not afraid to let Godzilla be scary. And I think that there's something, like Shin Godzilla it's way more about like the thematic content than it is about Godzilla being scary. I mean, Godzilla's scary in that movie, but Shin Godzilla is more about the bureaucracy and the red tape, and is bringing a commentary on that. Godzilla -1, it touches on everything that we love about the original film, which is commenting on war and commenting on the destruction of war, and also the idea of self-sacrifice, and the idea of how the people are the ones that suffer from war when it's the governments that are the ones that are sending us there.
Yeah. And
so it's making statements, but it's also making Godzilla a terrifying creature like it was in the original film. Godzilla's scary in this movie.
Yeah,
it's
and it's a really emotional film too, isn't it? I think.
100%.
Thing.
Well,
Like, it's
right.
another one that could make you cry for sure.
Yeah, it focuses on the people, and it makes us care about the people, which is why we care about what happens to them when Godzilla's coming after them. It's the same as, when we care about a character in a horror movie.
Yeah.
It's that much more effective when we care about who's being killed, because then we're caring about why they're being killed.
Yeah.
And if you get rid of why, I mean, sure, then that might be fun, and I'll watch it, but it's not going to stick with me in the way that a movie like Godzilla -1 does.
Absolutely. We've said it so many times on this podcast that, horror is the kind of, it's the genre of empathy, isn't it, really? Like, the point is you've got to feel fear for whatever these characters are going through.
Yeah.
And you've got to care, haven't you, I think, for them to be successful. That's fascinating. And then what about this kind of American wave of Godzilla movies we've had as well then? So obviously you've mentioned the Roland Emmerich movie, 1998, and then we had Gareth Edwards in 2014 and everything that's followed in that kind of monster universe that they're created, I guess, right?
Yeah, I'm sort of fascinated by this. I mean, obviously, it makes sense that they would try to do a MonsterVerse thing because the Avengers was such a big deal. And, like,
course,
everybody wanted an expanded universe, whatever. But briefly to talk about the Roland Emmerich Godzilla, I think that if you just called that Roland Emmerich's giant monster movie or whatever, I think it would be remembered a lot more fondly. It's a goofy movie. It's really dumb. That is not Godzilla. But there's some, silly, fun stuff in there. I actually like the MonsterVerse stuff. I know that there are people that are purists that don't really like it. Gareth Edwards' Godzilla, I think is quite good. I like how he handles the similarly to the original, where it takes a while for Godzilla to appear, and that gives Godzilla more weight when it does appear.
There's some great visuals in that film, like this visuals
really beautiful.
Stick with me. Yeah,
there's that famous shot from that movie of the flares, falling through the clouds. So that I didn't realize until after I'd seen the Gareth Edwards, and I went back and watched Godzilla Raids Again, the first sequel to the original. It's totally ripped off straight from Godzilla Raids Again.
No way,
100%, and it's great. It's done beautifully, but that's reason enough. Godzilla Raids Again isn't the best of the franchise, but that's reason enough. It has some cool shots in it, and that's one of them.
Yeah.
I really love Mike Dougherty's Godzilla King of the Monsters.
Yeah.
That is my personal favorite of this whole MonsterVerse saga. I know people don't like this movie for some reason. I don't really get it. It's like it's got this like melodrama of what's going on with the mom and with the with Charles Dance and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But seeing Mothra and seeing Ghidorah for the first time with like the modern CGI technology and seeing those battles, it makes me feel the way that I did as a kid when I was watching Godzilla in Showa era movies fighting, Gigan or something. Like my imagination was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but that's the way I was imagined, Mothra would be if Mothra were doing whatever.
Yeah.
So I really like King of the Monsters a lot. Godzilla vs. Kong, I think, is an absolute blast. It's obviously like big dumb fun, but it's done really well.
Yeah.
And then the new one, Godzilla X Kong, the new Empire. I also think is fun. Again, it's like big dumb fun, and I don't mind that at all. And I think that they do a good job, with the human elements in it for the most part. But what I'm really impressed by is I think they use the technology well to give the monsters personality.
Yeah.
Especially Kong. I have a little bit of an issue with, I feel like in the new Empire, Godzilla's sidelined a bit. But it's obviously Kong's movie because Kong is the one that we are inherently going to be able to empathize more with.
Right. Yeah.
But the Hollow Earth stuff's interesting. It's fun. It's very, very different from what the other Godzilla films are, but that's okay.
Yeah.
These are pure fantasy movies.
Absolutely.
And the new Empire in particular really felt to me like a late stage Showa era movie,
right,
where it is big, goofball, wild. There are suddenly aliens and hollow earths and all this stuff. And so I appreciate that, and I like that. I like that Legendary is leaning into the fun of Godzilla because I think that gets people more interested in Godzilla, which hopefully makes people want to revisit some of the other Godzilla films.
Okay, now comes the part of the episode where I thank some of our Kickstarter backers, of course, for helping us fund Final Cut, the official Evolution of Horror card game. I'm going to thank the next 30+ pledges. So a big thank you to Sarah, Lily Sanchez, Sarah Miravalski, Mark Sutton, Tracy Johnson, Ian on the drums, Brent Thompson, Angela Spetz, Ollie Dean, John Wilcox, Rebecca Smith, Sarah Miles, Andrew Higgs, Kyle Staines, Lauren Maloney, Harlan Kellaway, Michelle, Therese Kesey, Bridget Lippert, Joshua Reed, Wendy Adams, Anders, Vanessa Cordner, David York, Paul Heron, Daniel Hartler, Claire G, Simon Kinnear, and Eric Anderson. A huge thank you to all of those people for helping us fund Final Cut, the official Evolution of Horror card game, which we will be selling through our website later on in the year. And if you missed your chance at picking up your copy of Final Cut, if you didn't get the chance to back us on Kickstarter, then sign up to our newsletter to be the first to find out when we drop a batch of games to sell via our website. Just head to evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter. Graeme, isn't this amazing? Like, you've just whizzed through so many incredible movies there over the last 70, 80 years, basically, right? And I think, isn't it incredible that we're now living in a time where we're still getting, like, these big, profound Godzilla movies that are kind of meditations on war and grief and all of that kind of thing. But then we've also got the big fantasy, silly, spectacle, fun for all the family movies like Godzilla vs. Kong and that kind of thing, right? Both are existing, both are more popular than ever before. And I think there is something amazing, right? That these two characters of Kong and Godzilla, Godzilla is 70 years old, Kong is 90 years old, and both characters seem more popular than ever, right?
It's really amazing. And I think it shows the enduring power too of monsters in general, right? Like, there's something about them that even if you say you're not a horror fan, like I read somewhere that Godzilla is consistently in the top 10 most recognizable fictional characters around the world. No matter what country you go to, you show them a picture of Godzilla, they say that's Godzilla.
Yeah.
And that he's behind only, I think, the top two. This is like in the early 2000s, but I want to say it was like Mickey Mouse and then Freddy Krueger and then Godzilla.
Yeah.
And like with Freddy being there too, right? Mm-hmm. It just makes me go, like, even if you're not a horror fan, there's something about the iconography of these monsters that hooks us and that makes us feel something and that digs its way into us in a way that some other, I don't think of, I don't know, Gwyneth Paltrow from Shakespeare in Love, whatever her character's name was, I don't not knocking on that movie, but but yeah, like King Kong and Godzilla, you have these characters that, like you said, are 90 and 70 years old respectively, and people are still fascinated by them. Kids are still fascinated by them. You can still show a kid the 62 King Kong versus Godzilla, and even if that kid is one of those kids that's like, I don't like old movies, man, you show a 7-year-old that movie, they're going to be hooked, they're going to love it, and they're going to want to go play King Kong and Godzilla outside.
Yeah.
And it's just something about they're timeless, and I think that we're able to sort of imprint whatever we're dealing with in the moment on those characters that have now just become such a part of the cultural lexicon that they're always there, whether we think about them or not.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, what a beautiful note to end on, I think. Let me finish by asking you perhaps a difficult question, Graeme. Like, do you have a single favourite out of all of these movies you've just run through? What's your favourite?
So I'm gonna cheat a little bit. So my favourite is certainly the original. It has to be. It's a masterpiece. It's one of the greatest films ever made. If I discard that, I had two films in this franchise that I really, really, three. Because Godzilla -1 had to come out and screw everything up. I think that the objective best movie after the original is -1. I love that movie. I've seen that movie 4 or 5 times now. My favorite is Godzilla vs. Destroyer for all the reasons I said. And there is another movie that Ashiro Honda directed called All Monsters Attack that I want to give a little bit of extra love to right now. It's one of my favorites in the franchise. It is commonly listed as one of the worst of the franchise because it uses a lot of footage from previous movies.
Right.
But the reason that they did that is that they gave Honda something like 3 weeks from like conception to finishing the movie to make this movie. And they gave him like zero budget. So, but what the movie is about is it's about a little boy who's being bullied, and what he daydreams to try to escape like his life being bullied is he goes to Monster Island and he hangs out with Manila. And Manila teaches him stuff. And then eventually they encounter a bigger monster named Gabara, a bad guy, that Godzilla comes and saves them from. But essentially Godzilla and Manila are teaching this little boy how to defend himself, and how to be strong and how to be brave. And when the little boy then goes back to his real life, he gets caught up in this like kind of weird like bank heist thing that's kind of silly. But then he's able to stand up to his bullies.
Right.
And Honda always talked about this particular film, All Monsters Attack, as being one of his personal favorites, or rather his personal favorite after the original. That this was his like personal movie that he loved, because it is about the people. It is about this little boy. It is not about monsters fighting each other. It is about a little boy fighting against his bullies and overcoming his own fears. And there's a real sincerity to this movie, and you can tell that a lot of care was put into it, even if the budget's incredibly low, even if they had to reuse footage from other movies. I find it to be a really beautiful little film. So shout out to All Monsters Attack, not to be confused with Destroy All Monsters, different movies. This one's All Monsters Attack. But I want people to kind of reevaluate that one, because I love it. And anytime Ashiro Honda says it's his favorite of the franchise, I think we gotta listen.
That's incredible. Well, Graeme, thank you. This has been such a useful... I mean, for people like me, I'm kind of a novice to these movies. Like, I've seen a few of the big ones. I've seen a lot of the recent ones, the original, obviously, but so many in between that I am unaware of. And I'm kind of excited to dip in and give some of them a try. And I've got your book as well. And again, like, I recommend to everybody listening to this, if you kind of want a kind of good guide through these movies, because like you said, Graeme, it can be quite intimidating. Like when you look at this huge gargantuan list of movies in this universe, there are so many, and it's kind of like where to start. But the book is such a perfect kind of guide for that. Just remind people, like, where can they get it kind of wherever they find books?
Yeah, get it wherever you find books. I mean, obviously support your local bookstore. I always say that. And get them to order it if you can. It's Godzilla, the official guide to the King of the Monsters. If you are in America, for some reason on Amazon, it has it listed as Godzilla, the Ultimate Illustrated Guide. I don't know why it's listed as that. That's not the name of the book, but that's how, if you can't find it on American Amazon or something, that's what it is. But yeah, I mean, you can get it obviously on Amazon. I say always support your local bookstore if you can, or I think you can buy it directly from Welbeck Publishing, which is a UK-based publisher. They're who published it. They did a fantastic job. But yeah, take a look at it, and hopefully it'll, if you read a little bit about some of the eras and some of the movies, you'll get a sense of what might be the best way for you to start and dip your toes in. And I'm excited for you that you're going to start on this journey. I can't
wait. I'm going to report back to you, Graeme.
I hope you do. I want you to. I'm excited.
I love that. And just finally, let people know what you've got. You're a man who's very busy. You're always in a lot of movies. You're always involved in a lot of movies. What can people kind of expect to see you in or behind the scenes in next?
Keep an eye out on the festival circuit for The Lonely Man with the Ghost Machine. Again, we're premiering at the Chattanooga Film Festival, June 21st, in their online section, their virtual section. Unfortunately, it is geo-locked, so only in America can you watch it. But for you American viewers, I highly recommend it. It's also a fantastic festival that you should support. Keep your eyes open for The Lonely Man with the Ghost Machine. We are on the festival circuit this year, so hopefully we'll be coming someplace near you soon. And then, gosh, what else? I mean, I've got, a bunch of movies that I'm acting in that aren't finished yet. I've got a couple of films that I know are in post right now that I was acting in. Had a film. I don't know, a bunch of stuff. Buy the book, see the movies, see the movies, and and you can find me on Twitter. I refuse to call it X, but I'm still clinging on Twitter at Graeme Skipper. And I love to hear when people see Godzilla movies for the first time and what they think. So if you see these or if you want to talk about them, like, find me on there and let's have a conversation, because I love introducing people to this franchise.
Incredible. Well, Graeme Skipper, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my incredible guest, Graeme Skipper. God, that guy's knowledge is unbelievable. What an absolute treat and honour to have him on the pod. So let me know what you thought of this week's discussion. Did you love that conversation as much as I did? Because I had the best time. Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, of course, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook, or you can also join our Discord, in which you can chat to fellow listeners about the podcast, and you can also join the weekly watch-alongs. Each week, members of the Discord get together to watch the movie that's being covered the following week on the podcast. So this Sunday night, they are going to be watching Godzilla vs. Kong from the 1960s. That's going to be a really fun watch-along. So join the Evolution of Horror Discord. Links to that are in the show notes. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So on to next week then. Now, we had a week discussing King Kong, and we had a week discussing Godzilla, and of course we've only scratched the surface of these two monsters. There are so many more movies out there. We don't have time to cover all of them in depth, but we do have time to bring you a little Also Rans roundup. So next week, Kevin Lyons is returning to the podcast, and we're going to be whizzing through 100 years of Godzilla and Kong movies. So this will be a spoiler-free episode. It's going to be several short, quick-fire recommendations and reviews. So join us next week for a deep dive into the world of kaiju, right here on the Evolution of Horror.